Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm joined by Dave Bright and Dr. Ollie Runswick. Gents, great to see you.
Nice to be here.
Thanks for having us, Dan. Good to be back.
Well, Ollie, as you've mentioned there, it's your second time on. Super delighted to have you on. Dave, it's your first. Dave, let's start with you. Tell us a bit about what's going on in your life, what you do, and what sports you coach, and potentially why we're here talking with you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I spent the majority of my adult life coaching traditional martial arts, so specifically a style called Wing Chun, it's a style of Kung Fu. So about halfway through that 24-year career, I thought I need to know a little bit more about this. So I went to University of Chichester and did a sport coaching science degree. Got on all right with that, much to my surprise. So I did the sport and exercise psychology masters. I then fairly soon after that managed to get a job at Chichester, lecturing in sport coaching. And then at some point in there, Ollie arrived at Chichester. And when I was making little noises about I should maybe do a PhD, he very much encouraged me to do so. I'm still at Chichester, senior lecturer in sport coaching and part-time PhD student.
I'd love to take you back to that time when you thought, I mean, in your words, I need to know a little bit more about this. And I would imagine the sort of the traditional thought processes that coaches have when they say, oh, I need to know more about this, is they tend to dive into the domain-specific knowledge of their sport, right? They need to know more about their sport. But it sounds to me like you were a little bit more engaged with, well, you know, it's not so much the what of coaching, but the how of coaching. How is coaching done? Is that kind of what tapped your curiosity to become a better coach?
Yeah, for sure. So I was very lucky that my own coach throughout that time. Shout out to Master Paul Hawkes in Crawley. He was very open to the ideas of coaching and developing that and being up to date and seeing what's out there. So he sort of encouraged that with a lot of us right from the off. And then when I mentioned going to university, he thought it was a fantastic idea. Partly, I think, because he likes to learn from other people without spending the time and the money too much. So I was fine with that arrangement. So it really was, you can't go to any university in the world and do a degree in coaching of Kung Fu.
Right.
So I was forced to go abroad. I had to do a sport coaching degree. Yeah. But in hindsight, really glad I did, because taking off the constraint of the specifics of the sport you're involved in really opens things up. I think it's why I got very into skill acquisition as an idea very early, because I figured I would go to a university and lots of very smart people would say, oh, we learn this way. We figured it all out. And actually, I found out we've barely scratched the surface, which, that in itself was interesting. That was why I ended up there, really. It was a broad look at what coaching is and what science supports it, and then getting more into how that's researched and kind of understanding that side of it.
Really interesting, Dave. And one could argue it's not so much anybody at university is saying we've worked it all out. There are calls from many voices in academia to say, well, it just all depends, doesn't it? It just depends on your context. It depends on your lens of the world, and there is no one way, but it depends on so many factors within your environment, culture, etc., etc. I think it's
for sure.
I just think that's what fascinates me so much about it. And look, great to have you here today. And we're going to be unpacking a paper that you've co-written with Dr. Ollie Runswick. Ollie, it's great to have you back on. Can you reintroduce yourself to our audience, please? Tell us about you. Tell us about your work.
Thanks, Dan. Well, my journey's been a winding one. I'm currently a senior lecturer in the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College, London. My job title is Performance Psychology, but my background has mainly been in skill acquisition prior to where I'm at now. Although my work is very broad these days, I'm a bit of an applied psychology polymath, maybe. I'm working at the moment in, for example, spacesuit design from psychological aspects. I'm working a lot in XR technologies and sport and exercise. Still working in skill acquisition. And and starting quite a bit of work in neurodiversity and sport as well at the moment. So, range of things. I'm still doing quite a lot of work out there with sports. I'll be with ECB Women's Pathway next week for an annual visit with the coaches that we do, talking about decision making and training decision making. So a wide spectrum of things. But my background, my first ever job was coaching cricket. I had a gap year where I was full time coaching cricket and doing some PE cover in a school. Went off and studied sports science and got really into biomechanics for a while. Then quite into how people learn to do those moves, and headed off to study human movement science in the Netherlands, which is where I got really into doing research with David Mann at the VU Amsterdam. Did some work on vision in cricket and then a PhD in anticipation in cricket. At that point, I learned that I really loved psychology more broadly, so I started teaching evening classes at Imperial College in psychology. Went off to University of Chichester when I graduated my PhD, which is where I met Dave, where I was senior lecturer in skill acquisition. But during that time, I did a second master's in psychology to get my chartered status from the BPS. And 5 years ago, I then headed off to King's, where there was a new role where I teach sports medicine and psychology students. Wide variety of topics on performance psychology. And I have students who are really interested in music or business or aerospace or medicine and a variety of things. So I love learning from different domains and keeping my eyes on research in lots of different areas. And then with Dave, we've been working on some kind of pretty traditional motor learning type things, which we've been interested in talking about since the time we were at Chichester together. So it's been really fun, and it's great to be back.
Well, we're going to be talking about some of that work, but we will not be going any further until we interrogate you a bit more about that spacesuit, the psychology of a spacesuit. Ollie, tell us a little bit more about that, please.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we have a aerospace medicine program at King's, which is a specialism you can do as a doctor. And my background in doing work with XR technologies is part of it, but also applied vision research. Vision is a big issue in space flight. You have something called it's called SANS, Space Light Associated Neuroocular Syndrome, where you can lose some vision while you're in space. And some of the kind of basic constraints on previous spacesuit designs has been loss of visual field, fogging up visors, some very practical things where I collaborate with some different companies and also our aerospace medicine team to give the psychological aspect on some of these design elements. If someone's getting too hot, it doesn't just make them uncomfortable, it makes them make bad decisions. It might make their visor messed up. So I'm very much in a human factors type world in that side of things. But when you get into it, you realize it's people trying to do things really well.
Yeah.
And we're always trying to help people do things really well, whether I'm doing skill acquisition or performance psychology or human factors or whatever you call it. That tends to be my approach. And we often just find, how do we train someone to do really well at this task? How do we help them do that? And doing that in different spaces is a really interesting way to learn new things.
It's not a precocious bid to become the first sports psychologist in space, then?
Not quite. I think I'll be a bit down there. There's a few other people doing that kind of thing as well, Dan. So
There is, to be fair, there is. Really interesting. A classic sort of, as you mentioned, in the 1%, the marginal gains, if we want to use that term for, really, really interesting, as you say. An uncomfortable spacesuit is not a great spacesuit when you're in space, right? Look, we're here to talk today about some of your collaborative work, some of the work you've done together. Specifically, we're going to unpack a paper. It's a very specific paper, but I know it has broader meanings for those involved in coaching and sport in general. I'll go through the title of this paper, and then we'll build from there. So this paper is entitled "Task Difficulty Promotes Tactical Learning but Suppresses the Positive Learning Effects of Autonomy and Cognitive Effort." Dave, you led on this, ably helped by Jenny Smith, Phil Kearney, and yourself, Ollie. So coming to you first, Dave, tell me a little bit about the beginnings of this paper. Where does this come from? And what were you trying to uncover here? What questions were you trying to answer?
So it's really all rooted in my original motivation for doing the PhD in general. So
okay.
During my coaching, I was a big fan of challenge point. So this idea that if you shift the difficulty of a task relative to how someone is performing. You keep them at the right level of cognitive effort, and their learning outcomes are better. It's all about kind of task engagement control via difficulty. So I put that to use a lot in my coaching work after a bit of experimentation and a few failures, but I came away a big fan of it. I really like Challenge Point. And then when I got into academia, there was sort of towards the end of my masters, things like optimal were coming around. So this idea that there's more, I guess, what I might label softer variables. So things like motivation would be part of your learning setup as well. Optimal theory kind of being the poster boy for that. So when I was building ideas for the PhD, started looking into this stuff, it became apparent that there's not actually that much research on Challenge Point, but there is some stuff on cognitive effort being the sort of linchpin of effective learning. And by that point, there was starting to become a lot of stuff on optimal theory. But what was happening was someone would put out an optimal paper saying, oh, it's all about intrinsic motivation because we did it in this task. And then somebody else would come along with a different task and say, oh, yeah, but look, if we do it here, it's all about cognitive effort. No one was putting those two ideas to test against each other within the same task. So that was the start point of both the PhD and of this paper, was a direct comparison between those two frameworks that had been argued either way quite a lot by the time I started, but with no direct comparisons made. So the start point was, okay, well, let's put these two frameworks in the same place and see what we get.
So, correct me if I'm wrong here, I feel what I'm hearing, in very simplistic tones, it's a matchup, a duel between intrinsic motivation versus cognitive effort. What is more impactful for learning? Am I correct there, Dave?
Precisely that, yeah. Both of those two things done via the lens of two models of learning that support them. But that's essentially what I was looking at. Yeah, is it intrinsic motivation, or is it cognitive effort, or is there a bias towards one or the other?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because there's a strong landscape, and maybe we'll come over to yourself, Ollie, because I know we've had conversations about this both on the Sports Psych show and when we've communicated in the past together, that coaching is. More and more coaches now are selling in this notion of the importance of intrinsic motivation and trying to tap into intrinsic motivation. And yet we have a strong history of research suggesting that cognitive effort is really, really important. Do you think that they fight against each other, or do you think, I mean, obviously we're going to unpack this paper and we'll get some answers here, but have historically you felt that they fight against each other, Ollie?
That's a really interesting question. I think it being intrinsic motivation makes it a slightly more complicated question to answer than if we were thinking about something a bit more extrinsic, then making a task more challenging might have a bigger effect. I don't think we have two conceptually well-aligned concepts here. So it's very unlikely that we can be sure that they operate separately or together. And I guess that's part of the question.
Yeah.
But we will have some awareness that making things really, really, really hard might not be great for motivation, or making things really, really, really easy might not be great for motivation. But there's going to be huge individual differences in how that affects someone's intrinsic motivation for a task. And that kind of unanswered question about that you've just asked, I guess, is what interested me and Dave chatting about this for quite a long time. There's two very kind of distinct approaches which have totally different theoretical backgrounds, quite different empirical backgrounds too in the way the research has been done, but with very kind of clear, let's give them some autonomy or let's make it harder as the outcome for your coaching. Makes it easy to implement, but we don't actually know if, for example, my main question was, if we give people autonomy, will they not just pick their challenge point for themselves because they really know their own sport really well? We might not need to be bothering with all these interventions if we give someone who's really motivated to get better, we just let them pick stuff and they'll probably get better anyway because they're picking a really good level of challenge. And my kind of initial conversations and thoughts were really actually, well, in order to keep people motivated doing a task, if they know they have to keep doing it, they'll probably pick something that's quite a motivating level of difficulty. And that might be how things end up interacting. But I don't think we had too strong an answer. That was just the kind of chat we're having at the beginning, I would say.
When you reflect on that conversation at the beginning, and you reflect on your own viewpoint, your own lens back then, was that built from your experiences as a cricket coach? Would you say that, when you reflect on your cricket coaching, that players would, if you gave players autonomy to create a task or pick a task that related to improvement in their game, that they'd pick something that would be quite challenging, that would find that sweet spot, that challenge point sweet spot?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of individual differences there.
Okay.
I'll be thinking about myself as a player
Yeah.
as well. Something where you have a lot of autonomy might be more when I'm playing a bit of golf or something like that, where you practice on your own a lot, and there's a lot of up and down on what I'd pick on a day-to-day basis, depending on what kind of feelings I'd had. I've been doing some kind of military-focused work around this time as well, looking at cognitive effort and what people might need to be prescribed for physical training, and the fact that there might be some interaction with that as well. If you've been putting effort into loads of other things, you probably need a bit less effort during the day. It's more of a fluid question than someone's just going to pick the right thing. But it was an interesting idea that maybe by giving autonomy, we, by proxy, manage to optimize someone's cognitive effort for that state that they're in that kind of single point in time. If you've had a really hard day and I say, right, how do you feel like training today? You give them a bit of an autonomy, you might pick the right level of effort that's going to give you the most for where you're at personally. It's hard to dig into that kind of nuance in a experimental design, but we've tried our best.
Context matters, and time frame matters, and the challenges around somebody at that time matters. Coming back over to you, Dave, and kind of asking you the same questions from your experiences in coaching martial arts. When you think about those that you would have coached, would you have suspected that they would pick something that would be aligned with that challenge point, sweet spot, if given the autonomy to choose?
Hugely variable, to be honest. So,
okay, like Ollie.
Yeah, I had the luxury when I was coaching that most of my coaching hours were one-to-one, which I say it was a luxury because it's an incredibly selfish way to coach. You find out so much more about your own practice by doing one-to-one and just being able to concentrate on one person for an hour. Yeah. So I had lots of stuff. Once I figured out I could make Challenge Point work, I ended up getting to the point of building sort of drills and training protocols around Challenge Point. I had that much kind of flexibility in what I was doing, which again, hugely privileged to have had that and be able to sort of experiment as I go. But turning it over to more like a class situation, so I might have 30, 40 people on the floor, and you give the instruction, you give whatever drill it is and give the instruction, okay, keep it around here. If you're failing 3 times out of 10, maybe take it back a notch. And that's chaos. Some people will engage with that fully and be on board with it. Some people they'll almost want you to print out the research paper and bring it in to justify why you're doing it. Some people, and I think working in the traditional martial arts, there were always, I think you had a slightly bigger percentage of people that were there for a bit of ego, that they wanted to be the next Bruce Lee. So there would be people that if you gave them any autonomy whatsoever, they would always do the hardest version at the maximum speed, regardless of how badly they were doing it. So I think as you've already said, it's about context. And I think, like I say, I became a fan of it because of my one-to-one coaching, really. In a group setting, it is harder. It is much harder to do. I have seen it done well, but it is harder to do. And I think you need people on board as well. You can't do that if it's your first session with a group. Regardless how much respect they might have for you, I don't think you can set up that kind of practice and just have it go. There needs to be a relationship with that coach, and an element of trust is the big thing, where the people in front of you are willing to go, okay, well, this feels a bit weird, but actually the last time we did something weird, it came out pretty well. So I think that's the setup that you're in, and the relationship you have in that setup is really important and impactful as well.
So, Dave, take us through the process of the research here. Yeah, just unpack this for us a little bit.
Okay, so I was fortunate enough to start my PhD October 2019, which meant the world very rapidly wandered into COVID.
Good timing.
So, it was a case of them finding an online task that
Yes.
we could do to kind
Okay.
of try and skirt over those problems. So I found an online task. A couple of papers had been put out by Andrew et al. 2012 and 2016, where they used a racket on screen, just sliding on one axis at the bottom of the screen to intercept 3 dropping targets that came down right, left, and then centre. That was really good for me because there was just a basic version of the task. I could have an autonomous version of the task where you can change the racket size by choice of the participant on each repetition. And I could do challenge point as well because I could change the racket size depending whether they intercepted all 3 targets or not. So success or failure dictated the size of the racket. So along with that, because I also wanted to find out what the underpinnings of any effects might be, I took repeated measures right across acquisition and retention of intrinsic motivation and cognitive effort. Partly because certainly with the optimal theory research that's out there, you tend to find they'll give autonomy and then at the end of acquisition, they'll take a measure of intrinsic motivation when they've also reported that there's been better performance during acquisition. So that you can't really then divide out, okay, well, was it performance that gave the motivation or was it the autonomy to start with? So I tracked those psychological variables right across acquisition and retention to try and find some answers if any effects were seen.
Talk us through the results.
Okay, so short version, none of the models worked.
Expand on that, please.
So for the autonomous group, so that's leaning into the optimal theory thing, so they had choice over racket size, we should have seen elevated intrinsic motivation all the time they were having that choice, so right across acquisition, and we should have seen that lead to improved learning outcomes versus so there was a control group and a yoked group for the autonomous group as well. That didn't happen. For the challenge point group, we should have seen higher levels of cognitive effort and again improved outcomes over the control group and the yoke group. That didn't happen either. So there was no group differences right the way through. Everyone learned the task and it was still pretty robust at 30 days. So we did a long retention test. So the effects were still pretty robust at 30 days. No group differences. Motivation for everybody just lowered right the way across acquisition, and a few little spikes on the retention tests. We had those. We had immediate 24-hour, 7-day, and 30-day retention tests. So there was a little bit of movement, but again, that was done by group. No between group effects. And same with cognitive effort, steady throughout and really high throughout, which seemed to be the problem. That the task was doable but very difficult. So one of the sort of 2 main thrusts of the paper, one of them is, well, challenge point is great and optimal theory is great, but actually, if the difficulty is too high, those very subtle effects seem to get suppressed. They get washed away. So yeah, I then needed to look into why that might have happened. So I sort of went through the data with a fine-tooth comb. And what became apparent was quite often, if people were having a hard time, they would not try and intercept all 3 targets. They would just go for 2 because that's easier. So they were setting their own criteria for success, really. Just decided, I'm going to go for 2, and then when I can get those 2 on the left, I'll go back the other side and get centre and right, or whichever way around they were going to do it. And that happened regardless of group. So even the people that had control over their racket size and could give themselves a relatively easy task still showed tactical behaviour. So the other sort of thrust of the paper is, how often is this slipping through the net? If you're just looking for your expected outcomes in your data, what you expect to see relative to the models you're using, what are you missing? So I sort of found it by chance, really, because I didn't know what was going on. So I needed a much deeper look at the data. And maybe everybody out there is doing a really good job in doing that as well. But it did sort of raise my suspicions of, okay, well, if I just looked for, because I could have just ran the stats and put the means in a graph and said, oh, nothing happened. Actually, yeah, really interesting things did happen that weren't the things I was looking for, that I only found by being sort of fairly thorough and quite picky about the data. So yeah, didn't find support for either of those learning models. Not over anything more like a traditional high repetition training. So it was learnt, but nobody did better than anybody else. But people did ignore what I asked them to do quite a lot so they could have what they perceived to be a better time.
People ignored what you wanted them to do so they could
Yeah,
have a better time. So self-efficacy played a bit of a role there.
possibly. So that's part of the problem, really, because I didn't really know that was going to happen. I didn't have things in
Yeah.
place to track why those things might have occurred. I've done that since in a follow-up study. But yeah, for this one, because it was unexpected, it was then kind of, okay, well, that's happened. Let's do best assumption on the data that we do have. And it does seem to be that difficulty was the driving factor in making people deviate from the instructions.
Ollie, what does this mean to you?
There's some really interesting practical things that I think we've uncovered and Dave's uncovered in this kind of what we'd call more exploratory data analysis. I think that there's one key implication for people reading motor learning research, which is considering how often people, for example, measure an error distance without measuring how people got to that average error distance. And secondly, from a practical perspective, how often are we giving someone a task that's a bit too difficult, so they're secretly trying to do it in a slightly different way than we're trying to coach them to, in order to get, as Dave said, some kind of level of perceived success. Those are the really interesting thing here, and it's something I've become really passionate about in the last few years, is doing our best, although it's more difficult, to measure what people really do and not measure what we're telling people to do or constrain it too much. What's someone actually doing when we're trying to make them learn something? And one of my favorite bits of this paper is Dave displays the average difficulty, the average size of the racket that people chose on their autonomous group, and the average size we gave them for their challenge point. And they chose slightly smaller racket size than we thought would be optimal, based on the challenge point idea. But then Dave also presents next to that a picture of what happened on each individual trial, and it looks like you've just thrown paint at the screen. People are not being like, oh, it's a bit too hard, let me make it a bit smaller. They'll go tiny, massive, somewhere in between, up and down, play around, trying to set one target, then three, then two, and capturing. And I think my favorite thing about this paper is Dave's actually reported that and captured the messiness of someone learning a new task that's quite hard. And the thing that it makes me think of most from things that I watch is a young child learning to bowl in cricket, which is quite unnatural. So you'll find people trying to do it in lots of different ways. As much as you're telling them to keep a straight arm, it's not happening because they can't. So they're finding new ways of getting the ball from one end to the other. Things like that where it's just too difficult. Adults learning to hit a golf ball for the first time. You say hit it at this target, like it's too hard. So everyone's trying to find new ways of doing things. And this paper is a really nice example of the messiness of someone that's trying to do something that's quite difficult. People were quite engaged. Everyone learnt it, but they learnt it in their own ways in a pretty chaotic fashion, which seemed to then say, right, how hard this is much, much, much more important than all of these other potential theoretical mechanisms that underpin someone learning something. Maybe if we get the challenge exactly right, all the other things come out, or maybe if it's really easy, all the other things come out. Because we gave them something that was challenging, really quite difficult, it meant that everyone tried to find different solutions, different ways of doing it. And it made me think a lot about all the papers I've read that would never have measured those things, and really what are people doing when we're giving them these interventions.
It immediately makes me think. I mean, you've used the word chaos there quite a lot, Ollie, and you've graphically illustrated the different ways that people might try to learn a task. And the more difficult it is, the more experimentation that might happen. The more creative solutions that people might try to engage with. I suppose what I'm trying to say here that is it a graphic illustration? whether you meant to discover this or not, that learning isn't particularly linear, that it's kind of spotted all over the place, and people try to learn in different ways depending on the challenge that's being thrown back at them.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption. I wouldn't say it's the learning that we've looked at not being linear, but everyone got pretty consistently better at the task. It's the way that they tried to get better at the
Yes,
task that was not.
gotcha.
No one's going on a slightly bigger jump every time or a slightly steeper hill every time. It was a lot more varied than that. I don't know if you agree with that, Dave.
Oh
As
yeah,
a
for sure. And I think
observation.
I think the fact the word chaos has popped up is really nice. So when I was still coaching and doing a bit of coach development with some people that were also my sort of my kung fu students as well, and then I still use this idea with working with the undergraduates that I work with. I present challenge point as controlling the chaos. That you need to have some disruption in there. You need some noise because otherwise it is just linear and there's no new information coming out. So the example I use for my undergraduates is I bet everyone absolutely smashed it at doing their shoelaces up this morning, but you also didn't get any better because there's no new information there. So when you're coaching, it's about having enough noise there that there is some disruption. Your job as the coach is to control that level of noise, be that for an individual or for a group, and that's what we see here. I mean, I'm with Ollie. Yeah, my favourite bit if in this paper is that graph of the individual racket size selections. It's all over the shop, and actually the mean that I present in the other graph isn't anywhere near where those sort of bundles of selections are. So it's another thing to I think be cautious of, as Ollie's already pointed out, that when you're looking at stuff that just presents, oh, well, this was the group mean. Well, okay, well, make sure you're having a look at the standard error or the standard deviation as well. You know, is that group mean representative, or actually, when you look at those two groups, is it all over the shop? Because if it is, then you can be less confident it's your intervention that had whatever effect it might be you're looking for. But yeah, for me, coaching is, if I had one phrase to describe it, I think controlling the chaos might be it.
What does this mean to you as a martial arts coach?
The the nice thing, and again, I only know this in hindsight. The nice thing about working in the system that I did was that so my own coach would always say it's logical, but it's not natural. So you've got to train what's logical to become natural, and that was the reason I can remember him saying that is because every new student that walked through the door, I was reminded of that. That you have this entity that is 100% chaos, and then you're going to say, okay, well, all that chaos you're doing, none of that is any good. We need to do this thing instead. So for me, it was always about stripping back. I was a huge fan of slow training, to the point where some of the guys I used to train with, we used to have slow races. So how slow can you go through this sequence of movements without actually stopping? Because I think it gives you that understanding of where everything is and an appreciation of, okay, well, now there's no chaos. I can feel what's going on, and then you can identify errors, and then you can start to fix. So yeah, for me as a coach, chaos is inevitable. Your job is to strip it back to a workable point for whoever you're working with, and for you as well. You know, I mean, I can watch the Olympic diving, and I'm sure what they're doing is great. I've got no idea because there's too much chaos for me, right? I haven't got the setup to understand what's going on in there. So for you as a coach as well, control the chaos to a point where you can understand what's going on and you can see why the errors are occurring and how they can be fixed. But that's as a coach, that's challenging because people want to go full pace and they want to have fun, and which are all very valid reasons to come along and do the thing you're doing. But it's keeping boundaries on that is, I think, really important.
Well, boundaries on that, and without coming too much off topic, but just dwelling on what you've said, stripping it back as you've mentioned, and you've given a working example of, for example, slowing motion down and sort of reducing the representativeness of the practice, or lowering the fidelity.
Yeah,
It looks not a lot like the actual activity itself.
for
A
sure.
reduction of, or a purported reduction of enjoyment potentially. That's something as a coach that would be, and again, I respect, I don't want to come too much off topic here, but just dwelling on it, that's something as a martial arts coach that you would still engage in, that you would reduce that fidelity. It doesn't look like the actual competitive environment or the full speed environment. With slowing it down is probably less fun from the experience of movement. Coming to cognitive effort, there's effort to slow it down, but that would be a part of your coaching practice. That would be something that's important to you in order to reduce chaos.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, yeah. And to let them appreciate how they're moving. So, like I said, the luxury or the benefit I had of coaching something that when you look at how it moves, it's really weird. It does make sense when you look at the maths of it, but it's really weird, and it's not a way anyone would naturally move. So the benefit of that is getting them to understand how they move, which is, it's hard to do. And again, it comes back to the idea of having buy-in from the people that you're coaching and building that relationship and trust. We're sort of lucky in the martial arts. We have this really weird thing, and again, I won't go off on too much of a tangent here, but we have this really weird thing where you have someone at the front of the room that has a black belt, first degree, second degree, third degree, whatever it is. So it's accepted. Well, they're the coach in that context, but it's also accepted they're also the most capable person at this thing in the room. When you compare that to any other sport, that's nuts, right? No one expects Usain Bolt's coach to run faster than him. So we have that buy-in that you get from that sort of traditional hierarchy is really useful because you do get that trust earlier. But then the sort of corruption of it is people not being able to let go of their pride and go, okay, do you know what? I've taken you as far as I can, which I did a couple of times. I sort of handed people over to my coach and said, you know what, you're doing really well. This guy's going to help you out more. Yeah, you can only do that through people trusting that you'll let them understand how you want them to move, which is, as we've already mentioned, is complex, really complex.
Ollie, you're listening in. You work in multiple environments. Probably the spacesuit aside, how would this research? When you reflect, maybe you reflect back on your cricket coaching. You don't do that anymore, I don't believe, or other environments, like for instance, the golf environment you're working in. What does this all mean to you?
I've been thinking about. I still support cricket coaches a lot in
Of course,
skill
yeah.
acquisition. I've been thinking about some conversations I have, and I mean, Dave, take the diving example. I think one of the things I was thinking about, I was having a conversation about training in the women's game in cricket recently, and trying to get people just to try and hit the ball as hard as they possibly can, and not care where it goes. And we're trying to increase the power game, for example. And then having a conversation the next day with a boys coach who was saying, I can't get people just to try and work into the gaps. All they want to do is hit as hard as they can. And I don't know if that's representative of the different cultures in the different sports, or just the people that I was talking to. But for me, it's really interesting that Dave talked about that kind of level of control where, let's say when I was a teenager, if I was learning to do diving, which I've never done, I'd be like, I can swim, so I'll just go up to the 10-meter board, jump off and see what happens. Whereas the next person might say, well, I'm going to stand on a piece of paper, get myself a bit higher, and then maybe I'll gradually work it forward and back and a little bit. And you'll get those kind of different bits. There's a bit in the movie Eddie the Eagle where he jumps one jump and then just goes up the big one.
Yeah.
And it's for me, that's kind of what our learners were doing in our study in really different ways. Some people kept it really consistent, tried to say, right, I really want to be good at this first, and then I'll try and make it a bit harder. Other people were just like making it as hard as possible and failing completely. And I think that, like Dave said in his coaching, often people are trying to go 100% as fast as they can all the time and not doing it very well, and maybe you need to bring it back. What we were seeing is when we give someone even not just autonomy, but we're just manipulating the challenge based on some kind of external factors. Everyone's just choosing to experiment and do it in quite different ways anyway. So those are the things that was making me think of, those conversations about this idea of getting loads of error into practice is great, but I can't get this person who really lacks confidence or doesn't have that kind of individual characteristic of wanting to push it the whole time to get it wrong. Or the other end of the spectrum, where we get people who are so intent on trying new things all the time that they get it wrong 100% of the time in training, and actually sometimes they need to rein it in a bit. Those are the kind of conversations that Dave's examples made me think about in a different context of how can we get someone to be at the right level of challenge for them on that day. And giving autonomy will sometimes mean people take it in really, really different directions. And in a group setting, that can be hard to just manage practically. And in a one-to-one session, it gives you a little bit more control. The slow movement thing's an interesting one. I've seen that in other sports, particularly bowling and in golf as well, where people are just trying to get the right feels and then make it harder and accelerate and get speed back in, and those kind of almost almost methods, I guess, like throwing it all the way back to what you might learn about in the many years ago when I was doing GCSE PE or something like that, But those are the conversations I was thinking, how those different individuals attack the same task in totally different ways. Doesn't mean they're learning it at different speeds necessarily, but the coach might need to have some kind of insight on whether they're making it too hard or too easy, or whether it's fine and actually they're doing a great job learning from it either way.
Everything you're saying there is making me think. I don't know if I'm going to speak to exactly what you're speaking here, Ollie, but as you were speaking, it was making me think about, say, in golf at the moment. The landscape is changing. I know you'd appreciate this, Ollie, working in golf and being a good golfer and a golf fan yourself. The distance scenario right now, all young players are trying to hit it as far as they can, and the parameters, the conversation about parameters that coaches have to have with their ambitious young and older players who want to hit it further. I mean, obviously the pioneer to a degree, we could go back to Tiger Woods coming through at the end of the 90s and hitting it miles, but really Bryson DeChambeau, right, back at COVID, who opted to use lockdown to, again, if we're talking about what is the thought process of somebody and thinking about parameters, I am going to get as big and strong as I possibly can and experiment with how far I can hit the ball. I'm going to play about with actually entering the world's long driving contest while still trying to keep a stellar golf career going. And I'm going to hit it out there as far as I possibly can. Without trying to be so overly reckless. And he still seems to. I mean, we're recording now a few weeks after the Masters, and he spent the whole round trying to upregulate himself, as we'd say in psychology, by doing fist pumps and high-fiving the crowd, as opposed to Rory McIlroy trying to down-regulate himself and stay calm all the time, right? So there was an interesting juxtaposition there. But, you've got this. DeChambeau is kind of a walking example of this negotiation with self, with negotiation with coaches around working with parameters around skill, because it's how far can I hit the ball under pressure whilst not being reckless. Definitely no question, Ollie, but just a reflection, because I'd love to get your thought on that, because I know you will be a keen observer of this.
I think one thing that's definitely a caveat to the conversation we're having here compared to what we've been talking about the rest of the day is the examples here are people who are already incredibly aware of their own movements and incredibly good at ball striking. If you can middle it every time and get faster, then that's a really ideal situation. I think it's potentially useful to get people to get speed in super early doors. I might have to refer you to a physiologist or a biomechanist at some point in this conversation, but I had a really interesting call with someone doing their PhD on power hitting in cricket, because the theme's the same. Bat speed's becoming more and more important. The number one predictor is still the proximity to the middle of the bat for how fast the ball goes off it. And we were talking about the perceptual and cognitive elements of actually being in the right position to hit at the ball at the highest possible velocity for that particular delivery with your particular strengths in mind, which means you have to be incredibly adaptable. And actually, a few years ago, we saw Rory really try and bring more power and go south for a while in terms of scores, at least. Long term, he's probably hitting the ball better than he ever has from an observer's perspective. But I think thinking about those two individual examples where Bryson effectively was a lot better quite quickly, and Rory potentially got a bit worse, and in a few interviews was saying that he was really chasing the power too much. Slightly different approaches. Both have ended up being absolutely all-time world class in their sport, and both are two of the longest hitters because we do know it is that important. But they've maybe reached it in slightly different ways. I think that's interesting. But I think some of our players, or in this very miles away from golf task that we've been looking at, we're looking at people who don't know how to do it yet, or don't have an efficient solution yet. And sometimes we might need to help a little bit with finding a more efficient solution before we let people throw too much at it, maybe. I don't know if that's similar to what you were talking about earlier, Dave, but those are kind of my reflections watching. It's hard. I find it very hard to dive into people's training lives that I don't know much about, but from the outside perspective, I find it super interesting to think about slightly different approaches to get to a very similar point. But Rory started winning when he started hitting better wedges with more control. So again, there's lots to it. There's lots of elements.
And just very, very briefly, Ollie, as we speak, was it 2 days ago, a 14-year-old has become the quickest player in IPL history to reach 100, so 35 balls,
Yeah.
was it 100? 14 years old. How? I mean, it's just, talking about parameters.
Unbelievable, yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing to see young people. When I go and work with young people in cricket, especially, I almost find it like strange to watch someone who's just chatting with their friends like a normal teenager produce such unbelievably controlled movements, often at unbelievably high velocities. I'm sure you've both experienced that as well. Maybe in football, that sometimes get it too. What about you, Dave?
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've coached a few people over the years that I was so used to people really struggling right from the off for probably the first sort of 6 months to a year, because like I've already outlined, it was quite a weird thing to teach yourself to do. But yeah, there's a few that have really stuck in my head just because they could turn up and I would go, "Oh, have a go at this," and they go, "Oh, this thing, yeah, okay, exactly that. Do it again, okay, exactly that," and they just kind of hammer through it. And for whatever reason, they have, the physical or cognitive setup to just go, "Okay, we're doing this now." And I'd love to say, as someone who considers himself an educated coach, I figured out what that thing was. Didn't even get close. I think it's just those extremes of individual difference, and I think that's very hard to capture.
Do you think, Dave? I mean, just I suppose last question here. Did you think that happens much? Or does that happen much in fighting sports? Obviously you have a background in martial arts. I'm thinking UFC, boxing, where the cognitive side, the anticipation, decision making seems so important. It feels like, obviously physicality lies at the center of this. Physicality being strength and power and movement. But I just think I'm a huge boxing and MMA fan without ever having been involved in them myself. But I can imagine. I guess there are some people who are just able to anticipate things based on what they see. They see things that others can't. They scan in a particular way, so they see things, they anticipate quickly, and subsequently make a decision with their movement. Does that exist in your world?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So I think you can teach anyone to punch, kick, grapple, whatever it is. Those sort of mechanical tools, you could teach pretty much anyone to do that. That I've been very lucky in my career in that I've trained under at different times, and again, because my own coach was very generous, a couple of people that I consider to be in the top 10 martial artists in the world. Just phenomenal people. And yes, their physical skill was very good, but their perception was unbelievable. They would
Right.
defend what you were throwing before you knew you were throwing it. And it's just, when you say to them, how do you do that? How do I train that? And they just go, oh, just train. And it's because they don't know either, because it's just part of their wiring. Basically, they were built to do it.
Is that trainable? Is that coachable? Is that trainable? Can somebody acquire it?
I think the way I was used to approach like black belt grading, so I did put quite a few people through black belt gradings, was it's not expecting everyone to be at the same level. It's about percentage of your maximum potential. And I think everyone's maximum potential is different. And those people that I saw that were
Okay.
extremely good just had an otherworldly maximum potential. So you can get as close as your maximum potential will let you. But yeah, I've certainly trained under people that I've just looked and thought, okay, well, I could do 15 hours training a day for the next 10 years, and I'm not going to get there. It's just, they're just constructed by a god somewhere to be martial artists. So I was very lucky to have come across these people.
Is that your scientific opinion?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Yeah, love that. This is something we've been trying to measure for the last few years at England cricket in the pathways, like real understanding how we can differentiate game understanding and how we can capture it. New technologies are giving us a lot of avenues here because we can show all of those martial artists the exact same opponent with the exact same movements, which we've never been able to do before. How we train it is another question. It's certainly something we reckon we can measure now in the right context with the right equipment, maybe. But yeah, it's the reason I was reflecting on that is I've tested a few people who've become incredible young players, and we asked them to talk through like their kind of processes, and some I don't know, just hit it, and they're incredible. And then the next person says, "Well, I've looked at these 85 pieces of information, and I know that this is my best option in this situation, and I know he knows that, and I know he knows that. So now at this point, I'm here," and then they get it right every time, and then they get the same score as the other person who's like, "I just hit it." And there's real individual differences in those processes as well. And cricket's different because you have a gap in between the deliveries. Where in a martial art, I don't really have time to check all those points of information and think about it that much. I imagine that would be a fairly deadly thing for me to do, Dave.
yeah. It's not too much thinking time. Yeah.
But no, it's fascinating.
Knowledge of, knowledge in, right? As the ecological
Yeah.
dynamicists among us like to say, knowledge of versus knowledge in the game. Absolutely fascinating, James. Really, really cool, and I'm really pleased that we had a really broad conversation around this. Dave, what's just before we do close? What's next for you? Where's this going?
Well, grand plan is get the PhD wrapped up by the end of this year. So end of wherever we are, 2025. So study 2 is nearly ready to go out for peer review. I'm just writing up study 3 now. Study 4 is ready to go, and actually had a meeting with Ollie and the other supervisors early today that we've now got a fairly concrete idea of what study 5 is going to be. So yeah, lots of that to do, lots of sitting and writing, but I'm thoroughly enjoying it at the moment. It's really good.
Brilliant. And Dave, I know you would have tapped the interest of everybody listening, and not least, I'm sure many would be interested in the paper. So how can people find you, follow you, and potentially get in touch if you'd be open to that?
I would be open to that, yes. So I can be contacted via d.bright@chai.ac.uk. I am on LinkedIn under Dave Bright. I don't think there's many people called that, so you can probably find me. I'm the bald smiley man if you're looking at profile pictures. Yeah, I'm not very good at other social media, so those are your options. Ollie's much better at that stuff, so you can contact me via Ollie, my new secretary as well.
Coming over to Ollie, who's delighted to be your new secretary. Ollie, how can people find you, follow you, and potentially get in contact?
Thanks, Dave. Yeah. LinkedIn's my number one spot now. Oliver Runswick or Ollie Runswick. There's, again, very few other people with my name, so go for that. If you're interested in the wide variety of things going on, then Morphlab, that's morph-lab.co.uk is my lab website, where we'll have updates on all the different types of things going on in sport and in other spaces as well. So one of those two options is your best bet, but LinkedIn's the usual starting point, I think.
Fantastic. Gents, thank you so much for today.
Thanks for having us.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having us on.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast episode, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.